The Biophilic Leadership Summit is the only multi-day conference entirely dedicated to biophilic projects, principles, and research, bringing together the top industry leaders in an intimate, natural setting to network, build partnerships, and learn from each other.
This year's summit will explore biophilic placemaking and how we can use biophilic principles to promote health, happiness, and vitality in public spaces.
In addition to fascinating presentations, delicious farm-to-table meals at Serenbe, and cocktails, this year's summit will feature a selection of biophilic experiences like forest bathing, bird watching, and more.
So join us in Serenbe for the 6th Annual Biophilic Leadership Summit from March 24th to March 26th, 2024.
Learn more about the summit and register today at biophilic.summit.com.
That's biophilic.summit.com. We hope to see you there.
Hi, I'm Monica Olson.
And I'm Jennifer Walsh.
And you're listening to the Biophilic Solutions Podcast, where every other week we sit down with experts and thought leaders across industries in order to explore the innate connection between humans and nature and why we need nature to thrive.
We truly believe that in order to tackle the global environmental problems we're facing, we as humans must reconnect to the natural world and come to a better understanding of how we fit in and how we are so interconnected. So in every episode, we'll interview new guests that help us uncover and highlight nature-based solutions to get us on a path to greater health, tackling climate change, and ultimately getting outside and connecting with nature.
So let's get to today's episode.
Hey, Monica.
Hey, Jennifer.
So, Monica, what are we talking about today?
Today, we're diving into the green economy. We'll talk about what that means and how economies around the world should start valuing nature and shift to truly sustainable green economic systems.
This is such an important topic, and I'm so glad that we're talking about it. The fundamental flaw in many economies around the world is that nature and natural resources are treated like a given, as if they are unlimited and free supply for raw materials and for dumping waste. Being able to reframe nature in economic terms could really help us move the needle in terms of limiting emissions and sustaining a livable planet.
Absolutely. So one thing that's really important to us on this podcast is balancing optimism, hope, and new ideas with the reality. We never want to greenwash, but we also don't want to push people away from the conversation without providing some potential solutions. So when we talk about putting a dollar value on nature, it can sound a bit of a bummer because nature has such an intrinsic value. Yet we also live in a real world, and we can see that one of the only ways to protect nature might be with the major players, especially in corporations and government, is they can see by devaluing nature, they're really shooting themselves in the foot.
Gosh, that is so true. You're absolutely right. So our guest today is Dr. Edward Barbier. Ed is a university distinguished professor in the Department of Economics at Colorado State University, where his main expertise is in environmental and resource economics, as well as international environmental policy. He has served as a consultant and policy analyst for a variety of national, international, and non-governmental agencies, including many UN organizations and the World Bank. His latest book, Economics for a Fragile Planet, offers a blueprint for how global economies might shift to greener, more inclusive models.
We really could not have found a better person to talk about these issues. So I'm beyond excited to share this conversation with our listeners. So let's get to our interview with Ed Barbier.
Hey, Ed, we're so happy that you're with us today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Monica, I've been talking about having you forever, so we're thrilled that you said yes.
I appreciate it. Great.
Yes. And I think we want to just sort of like jump right in and ask you a little bit about how did you get interested in environmental economics?
Well, interestingly enough, I didn't start off thinking about becoming an environmental economist. I actually was interested in development issues, particularly issues concerning how do poor people and poorer countries use natural resources to develop. So I was very much interested in development economics. And then it became clear to me that natural resources and the environment were fundamental to people's livelihoods, particularly the poor. And developing countries depended so much on exploiting natural resources that I became interested in environment resource economics as my main area. And I've retained that interest with the interest in natural resources and development through my career. And that also extended to, as I said, well, wait a minute, it's not just poorer countries, it's all countries that depend on the environment. And the environment is so fundamental to the welfare of everyone. So I started to get interested with other colleagues in how do we make our economies more environmentally sustainable. Because clearly, even 30, 40 years ago, it became apparent to a number of economists that we were not on the right track. And so that got my interest in green economy issues and the transitions to becoming greener. And that's led to my current book.
Well, I think that's really fascinating too, before we even get started even further, but the fact that you have this love for economics, but also your discovery of how nature's impacted by the economy. And then that unraveling and that kind of peeling back the layers of understanding really led you to this whole new world of the green economy. And again, how long ago that was, it's really, really great.
Yes, the first book that I published with my co-authors, David Pearson and Anil Markandya, was actually in 1989. It wasn't my first book, but it was my first book on the green economy. It was called A Blueprint for a Green Economy. And it really did shake some minds a little bit in terms of thinking about sustainability and how we get there. Sadly, we're still not there. So to try and improve. And now it's getting more urgent. So that's why the focus of
yeah. Well, and that's an interesting thing. So your current book is Economics for a Fragile Planet that I think just came out this March, maybe this spring.
Correct.
And so between 89 and today, 2022, what have you seen in the culture or society of any hopeful changes for solutions?
Well, I've seen some hopeful changes. We certainly are debating and talking about making our economies greener and reducing our impacts on climate change. But this whole period of time from the 1970s to today, we've seen an acceleration of human impacts on the environment. You take any indicator you want, and in fact, I show a few in my book, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions or whether it's fisheries production and whether it's biodiversity loss and so on, and even pollution. You can't even put plastic pollution on this graph because it's been exponential from nothing to suddenly plastic is everywhere in the oceans. So anyway, our human impacts on the environment have accelerated to the point where many Earth system scientists and other scientists have said, wait a minute, we are now entering a new era that's been unprecedented called the Anthropocene. And what's different now compared to just 50 years ago, and certainly 100 years ago, is now human impacts on the environment and on nature and the biosphere are so significant that we're disrupting some very important Earth system processes and ecosystems. And I've seen that in my work because I've worked in various areas of the global environment. Certainly climate change is one of the big environmental risks we're facing right now, but there's also deterioration of our oceans and our coasts. There's rising freshwater scarcity everywhere in the world, particularly in the U.S. West where I live. And then finally, there's a loss of biodiversity. Land use change is so significant around the world, particularly in the tropics, that we're losing biodiversity hands over fist. And so these are all huge risks that could push us into either an uncertain future or one that's got catastrophic outcomes for humankind on a regular occurrence. And we want to avoid that. And what's led us there is a way in which we have designed our economy, our governance, our institutions, and our markets so that we've excluded nature from our basic market and policy decisions and business decisions. And what we need to do is rethink how we do markets, governments, and institutions so that we embed economy within nature. And it's a tall task, but that's what we need to do to slow down these risks that are going to be very troublesome for us in the very near future.
Is that because, what you're seeing right now, what you're saying is it because we've gone along, governments and businesses have always underfunded and underpriced nature because we need it, but it's always been underfunded, underpriced?
That's exactly where we are right now, is that the consequence of treating nature like it's out there, it's an infinite source of raw materials and energy and an infinite sink for all our waste, which is how our economy is structured and has been for thousands of years. But at this critical time, it's reached the point where we have overburdened nature. And the key indicators, as you say, in our economy are that we underprice nature. All the good things it does for us aren't taken into account. And we also actually subsidize activities that harm nature. So we actually pay many of our economic activities to do harm for nature, even though nature does so many things for us. And unfortunately, there needs to be redressing that balance. We need to reduce the environmental harm that our economies and certain activities do to nature. And we, at the same time, need to take into account the good things that nature does for us, whether it's protecting our coasts against storms, or whether it's watersheds, recharging water and controlling through rivers and streams and controlling erosion, whether it's biodiversity within habitats that supports everything from pollination of crops to basically controlling infectious diseases that could break out like we've seen with COVID. All these things are valuable services that nature does for free. We need to think about these inputs as being just as valuable as capital that we produce within our economy and labor, which we train up and educate and skill, because they all work together to provide the goods and services that we want. And that's what I mean about rethinking markets, institutions, and governments. It's a huge task, but it's one we have started on. We just need to do it more quickly and urgently.
Because I think a lot of what we see is, Monica and I talk about a lot on the podcast, is there's always this focus on governments and the governmental regulations. But do you also see that's a lot about markets? So how these businesses do business should be more focused on the nature economy and how their businesses are going to be very catastrophic if something isn't done to stop what they've been doing, if you will.
I agree completely. I mean, this is one of the things that has changed a lot in the last 10, 20 years, is that now the recognition, it's not just individuals that are made worse off, but businesses depend so much on nature. Studies that have come out recently have shown, including studies by the World Economic Forum, that global business, so many sectors, their supply chain can be traced all the way back to nature. And along that supply chain, from raw materials and water, all of that depends on nature. And then as it goes through the supply chain and gets to the final consumer, all those pathways depend on nature too. And so the estimates are huge, equivalent to about half of global GDP from industry and services depends on nature in some form. Equally, businesses are facing monumental risks themselves. Many of the larger companies and corporations want to stay around for a while, and suddenly they realize, well, we're dealing with climate risks. We're dealing with water scarcity. We're dealing even with biodiversity losses. Raw materials are scarcer than we thought. Why are they disappearing? And they want to deal with these risks. And more importantly, their investors want them to. The investors want to know, if we invest in this company, how do you deal with not just market risks, but all these environmental risks that are coming along? So there is this rethink going on in business and this interest in more sustainable practices. Unfortunately, once again, we're sticking our toe in the water of sustainability, not jumping in. And we need to have a little more urgency and more realization that these opportunities, particularly in the private sector and the market, actually can be economically profitable for businesses. The businesses that actually become more sustainable can reduce their costs too. And the investors will put more money into them. So it's starting to be this movement. The problem is, of course, that we still don't see it as being a full-fledged commitment. And it's almost like you're at a doorway here and you're sort of saying, after you, who's going to go first?
Yeah.
Door and go through. That's a big deal. But we're starting to see some progress. Unfortunately, though, we have to recognize there are business interests that have a big stake in the status quo, in keeping the economy brown for polluting and not dealing with the costs of pollution. And what they fear is the increased costs to them of a change. And there will be a cost. We can't sugarcoat it. We can't say, okay, the transition to being a greener business is going to be free. It's not. It's going to cost you. But if you do it correctly, you can also make more money than it actually costs you. And there will be some losers as well. And those ones that are going to see their industries decline, they're going to fight back, and they are fighting back. And they're trying to hold back the tide, so to speak, which is an analogy for what we're thinking with coastal defenses. But But nonetheless, the point I'm trying to make is that we're at this critical crossroads where we have the biosphere stewards in industry are starting to realize there is a possibility of change that is for the good and for them also very helpful for their bottom line. But we have the biosphere exploiters that have a very powerful interest group and still hold sway, unfortunately, on many of our business and policy decisions.
Well, and I think that you said that almost 50% of GDP is based on nature, which I think is an interesting place to start for many of the businesses and government, because it appears that nobody, and I'm using air quotes, wants to do anything because of politics or fear of getting blasted by whatever the gas and oil industry or not getting funded, or they see it as a two-sided issue when it's really just a human issue, right? But we end up in these very exclusive places against each other, if you will. And so I think if you sometimes can start talking financially, and so tell me about, I know, so in the book, it sort of talks about, and I love how you think about markets, institutions, and governance, like how we have to think differently about them. But you've really built the book on 5 principles, and they're all fabulous. But I'd love to start with sort of the underpricing of nature. And I read, I'm sure you're aware as an economist, of Mark Carney, right, who wrote Values. And I think he has an example in the book, and I'm not saying this is his original idea, but why do we value Amazon more than the Amazon jungle? And I thought that was sort of a good way to start conversations with people, because everything can be so abstract. But in that example, I think we understand why Amazon, the corporation, is valued a certain way, because we're used to valuing businesses. But the rainforest, somebody buys the land, right, to cut down trees to, I don't know, graze cattle, let's just say. I've purchased the land. I can do whatever I want with it at that point. And right there is where we need to start people changing minds, right? Not even that you can do whatever you want with it, because I guess maybe we could say, you can, you've bought it, but we need to price in these externalities of what you're going to do with that land. So do you have an example like that? Like, how would we start saying to that individual who wants to cut down all the trees and graze it for cattle, what do we say to that person? Like, not you own the land, but now we have to put a price on that, what you're about to do to it.
Well, the first place you look at, and this unfortunately is true over most of remaining natural forests, it's like, who gets the land in the first place? Most of the environment, except for the international oceans, are owned by somebody. And usually the tropical forests are ostensibly owned by the governments that have them. But unfortunately, most of our governments still view nature in the same way that we've viewed it for 10,000 years. It's something out there that is not valuable to us unless we do something to it to bring it within our economic system. So then what would we do? Well, okay, the peatlands and the forests out there are not valuable unless, of course, we lease some of the land for mining. Because oil is valuable and fossil fuels and gold is valuable. We don't lease the land. We don't treat the tropical forest in situ as valuable unless it's converted to palm oil or soybean or ranching. So right away, there's that mindset that says nature out there is not valuable to us unless we convert it. Equally, we go a step further and we say, okay, we want to encourage these commercial activities because they generate money that we can use for government taxes, for revenues, for exports, for jobs, all these things. And so we actually subsidize the activities. We give away leases for free, or we give credit. We give the land. In many tropical countries, and particularly Latin America, there has been this longstanding thing is that if you convert the land, it's yours. And then on top of that, it's now valuable land. We'll give you credit for having it in production, and we'll give you so this goes on. And then we give credit for you. You can get loans at lower interest rates because you're doing something productive for our economy. This is the way our system works today. And it's not just in tropical countries. We still have this system here in the United States. For example, we're still subsidizing fossil fuel production and exploration at tens of billions of dollars in the United States. And we don't price carbon. in the United States. We do that at the state level, but not at the federal level. Now, there's a lot of political reasons why this carries on, but it's the mindset. It's not taking into account all the damages that the burning of fossil fuel do, from climate change to health and from pollution, health consequences of pollution, and also congestion costs and so on, and not to mention lost revenues for all this to the government. All these things are real costs to our people and our economy, yet we carry on with that. And that may have made sense in the world where nature was so abundant and economies were so small, and it seemed that we could absorb those costs without any difficulty. The world's not like that anymore. There's 7 billion people on the planet. There are all these economies that are developing, producing, polluting, and the damage to nature has reached such a scale and has happened at such a speed that we need to rethink it. That's where collective action comes in. And we're seeing some progress on that since the Paris Agreement with climate change. We know, for example, with climate change, what we have to do as a globe. It's trying to convince countries to do that and get there. And some countries are doing it or trying to move in that direction. Some very important economies are trying to do it. And I'm encouraged by every step that we take, whether it's California suddenly saying, okay, we're going to phase out sales of gasoline fueled cars by 2035. We're just going to do it.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. Or the recent bill that went through Congress and was signed by Biden said we're going to put in some incentives. But for me personally, it's not enough until we start to take seriously the change what we need in markets, institutions, and so forth. Last thing I'll say, going back to your tropical forest example, it's a very interesting thing that sometimes some of the most unexpected countries have made some important changes that could be good roadmaps for other countries. One of the things I talk about in my book, based on a study that was published by myself and some co-authors in Nature, is that two developing countries with tropical forests, Costa Rica and Colombia, have engaged in a policy that's called a tropical carbon tax, which has not up to now received a lot of attention. Costa Rica adopted this policy way back in 1997. Wow. Colombia has adopted it in 2016. And what this policy involves is putting a tax on fossil fuels, certain fossil fuels, particularly imports into these poorer countries, and using some of the revenue to invest in nature-based solutions, which are solutions to restore or conserve ecosystems in their economy, mainly tropical forest systems, but also wetlands and so forth. And in the case of Costa Rica, at least 40% of the communities affected are the poorest communities in rural areas. So it also adds to another principle, which I suggest, which is inclusivity. So not just promoting sustainability, it's also promoting inclusivity. So that's a win-win policy. And other countries are starting to get interested in this idea. I'd like to see more and more tropical countries do it, and also show that why can't we do that in the richer countries too?
Yeah.
Why not think of it? Nature-based solutions are really cost-effective ways of protecting nature and also reducing carbon. We should be seeing more of that. And also that gets to the other problem. It's the underpricing of nature that's a major problem, but it's the underfunding of nature that is also a problem. We have to, much of my book is devoted to innovative ways in which we can boost our funding of protecting and restoring nature, which is important. It's easy to come up with things we have to do. We need to restore and conserve peatlands. We need to protect our coasts. We need to save water. We need to invest in watersheds and protect those. There's tons of things we need to do. How do we fund that? And how do we go forward funding it? What we've done so far is we've left it to governments to do. Governments around the world are putting money into doing this, and poor countries are asking rich countries to give them money to help doing these things because they benefit everyone in the world. And that's correct. The problem is that how much we need to do is in 900 billion, trillion, maybe a trillion, maybe almost $2 trillion is what we need going forward. At the moment, we're spending only $100 billion. And because there's so many competing uses of government revenue, it's hard for governments to keep raising more money. So we have to think creative ways of doing it. But more importantly, we have to get the private sector involved. The business, it's not good enough just for governments to do these things. Businesses have to get involved, and that's where we get into green financing, green investment, public-private partnerships, and businesses just recognizing we got to protect the environment as well. It's fundamental to our business.
You're speaking our language. Monica and I talk about almost daily, nature-based solutions. That's why we created the podcast with our wonderful producer, Katrina. And I think what's really interesting, there's so much you just said, but you talk a lot about protecting the watershed. Do you think water is going to be, I mean, we already know water is a problem. There's droughts, there's rising waters. I live on the East Coast in the New York area, and we're always seeing so much more flooding. So do you see that water is going to be a really big component of what we need to really hone in on and really kind of study? How do we ramp up and fix or heal, or what are you seeing?
Oh, absolutely. And it follows the same principles. In fact, the book I wrote before this, published by Yale University Press, is called The Water Paradox, How to Manage the Global Crisis in Water. And basically, it's the same thing. Underpricing of water has been a hallmark of our economies. And we've, again, assumed that governments and public utilities will provide water to us, whether we're a business or whether we're a household. And we haven't thought much about, as the source of that water gets more scarce relative to all the demands we're making to it, and as it gets more polluted, how do we take into account that scarcity? Now, if you were talking about a good that was produced in our economy, let's say a product that you could buy on Amazon, going back to the Amazon versus Amazon, supposing you want to buy a pair of shoes on Amazon. Well, if there's not enough shoes to meet all the demand, the price of those shoes would go up. We don't see that. We don't see, first of all, water markets very well developed in many parts of the world. Even where there are prices for water, the prices for water only reflect the last delivered amount of water, what it costs to get the water from the utility to the consumer. Doesn't it reflect the growing scarcity that's out there and the amount of investment that we go into dams, reservoirs, pipes, everything else that we do to bring that water, much less the source of the water in the ecosystems? And I'm afraid we have to think more carefully about this, because otherwise we just go on wasting water. Now, I live in Fort Collins, Colorado, and one of the interesting things that's happened recently where I live is that they have finally made it legal to use gray water in households, where gray water is like the water from your dishwater and from your showers. So it's not, of course, the sewage water, but it is water that we routinely just dump out into the same system as our sewer water. But you can now, if you want, recycle that water in your house. And that simple change could impact quite a lot on water use. You could make households more self-sufficient in recycling. But unfortunately, we have tons and tons of regulations that stop us from doing that. In parts of the US and parts of the world, there's only one use for water, which is agriculture. You either use water or you give it to another farmer to use it or sell it to that farmer. You cannot have water sold from farming use to, let's say, city use. So there is no way of doing that transaction. We have to change that and also facilitate the buying and selling of water, both short-term and long-term. It's starting to happen here in the West, and we're starting to see, as a result, more conservation taken on by various cities. But it's getting too late. We still are reacting to water crises by bans after the fact, by saying, okay, we don't have enough water in the Colorado River, so Arizona farmers aren't going to get water this year, and neither are farmers in the southern part of California, including the Central Valley. That's quite frightening, because the Central Valley in Southern California produces a lot of food and other agriculture products for our economy. We have to think more proactively rather than reactively, which is how we're responding to water crises, and unfortunately to many others.
Well, and I think that's an interesting segue into another principle, which is accepting absolute limits. And you're right. We just expect to turn on the tap and there's the water. I mean, we are so privileged in the majority of the country, but there's many people that don't have access like that. But in sort of a U.S. situation, we just assume we're going to turn it on. Now, we've heard, and there are challenges now with sort of the water itself, like does it need to be filtered or lead, and all these questions that are an infrastructure issue. But I think you're right. Arizona is a great example. There's been a lot of reporting lately on they just sort of gave away their water to be farmed by overseas countries without real pay. And you kind of wonder, how do these things happen on a government or business level? And I think nobody's valuing it. So talk a little bit about absolute limits, and we can stay on water if you have a different example you want to use, because I'm sort of fascinated by that, because I think in the West, we are not used to having limits, right? We don't want to be told no.
Yeah.
So I'd love to figure out, how do we move people's brains?
You're absolutely right, Monica. I mean, this is something that I talk a little bit about early on in the book, is that our conception of nature and the environment and everything it does for us, whether it's water or trees or fossil fuels, whatever, we treat it as a frontier. We treat it as an unlimited frontier. And our view of our economy is that it's a circular system that's got markets and it's got consumers, and producers on our markets make sure our consumers and producers buy and sell products and allocate labor and capital and all that, which is true, it does. But we treat the rest of the outside of us, the nature, outside the economy, as this unlimited frontier. So it's an unlimited source of anything that comes into it, whether it's water, trees, or fossil fuels, and it's a limited sink for our waste. And so as our economy grows and expands, we basically assume that there's still an unlimited frontier to exploit. Now, in our Western United States, it is legitimately a frontier economy. It was established that way in order to settle it in a very big period of settlement from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century and continuing on into the 21st century. So it still has a frontier economy type ethos to it. And water in particular in that way, but so many other things. But we've now reached the point where our cities and our industries in the West are growing so much faster than agriculture, but yet water, 70-80% goes to agriculture in the West. That has to change, but it has to do it in a way that doesn't endanger our agricultural production, but at the same time that changes. Now, to do that, one of the first things you have to do is recognize there's an absolute limit to how much water is out there in the West. It's a semi-arid and arid region. It doesn't have a whole lot of water. So if we start from the premise that water is limited and we design our economic institutions, governments, and markets in order to address that limit or to work within that limit, then that's how we can proceed. Another example is with climate change. Like I said, we know what the limit is. We want to limit global emissions of greenhouse gases to keep us within 1.5 degree, if possible, hopefully 2. I think we've missed that boat.
I think we've sort of missed the 1.5.
Yeah, we're going to try desperately to stay within 2 degrees Celsius warming on average across the world, which means some regions are still going to get hotter. We know the limit. We know what that means in terms of how much we have to reduce our net carbon emissions. So we know that limit, at least with climate change. What we have to do is accept that limit and work with it and read, okay, what is it that individual countries have to do? What do we need to do collectively as government? Now, the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, people had that for the first time, a collective understanding. This is what we need to do to stay within 2 degree warming. We now have to make sure we carry that out and everyone commits to that and that it becomes an important agenda. And then the same thing with habitats and nature. Where are the limits with biodiversity and land use change? With our oceans and coasts, how much plastic? What's the limit on the plastic pollution we're going to tolerate? We do have to do this. Now, what's interesting is that we do this all the time with very smaller scale pollution and environmental problems. So if, for example, we want to say limit how much arsenic is produced, we say, okay, we got to limit arsenic, or how much lead is produced in products, or even we say, okay, this is how much to keep health. Our economy can still run and keep our health effects down to limit the damage to people and to nature. We set a limit and then we say, okay, how do we achieve this limit? Well, we can regulate, we can ban, we can tax, we can do all these things. Why not do that with everything that we know is going to risk our global environment? But we're not there yet, mentality-wise. That's the problem.
Right. And the California law of banning no new, is it no new production or no new gas powered can be sold? Is that it in
That's
states? Is
correct.
that what they're in?
By 2030, I think 2035.
And did I hear that there are other states that have trigger laws, which God forbid we're using on other issues. But I heard like maybe Massachusetts, like some of the states have like an immediate, when California does something like that, Massachusetts like falls right in line.
Washington, I think, is
DC. Okay.
Oh, no. Washington State. Washington State has something similar. I don't know if it's a trigger law, but I think they are going to adopt something similar. That's the latest I've heard.
Sometimes that stuff can just snowball into an actual, because the car manufacturers at that point, if you get 17 states on board or even California and a couple other big ones, it doesn't make sense for them to build anything else. Now, a lot of the manufacturers have already made great commitments to going all electric. But I think as a consumer, when you hear a big state like that, it wakes you up quite a bit more because you're like, oh, well, if I'm buying a gas powered car after 35, I mean, I know I'm part of the problem already, but like then I'm really part of the problem. So it's like, I'm always fascinated. How do we get consumers to change their mindset? Another stat I read, and I'm a little all over the place on this question, but is that if we individuals all stopped doing all the things that are quote bad, it would only really help the environment by I think like 22% or something like that. Like we would only get to 22% of the goals. So it really is private, huge institutions, governments, and businesses that really, really need to do it. But we have power, we have agency to help make those changes or demand those changes. What other things are you seeing that are positive like that, like the gas ban that's happening across the country that you think is realistic that could, I'll use the word snowball?
Let me go back to the California example. Sure. One of the things I really like about it isn't just this general rule, but the enforcement mechanism that they've included. And I may not get the right, but basically, if the car companies and retailers don't comply with this rule, they're going to be charged a tax of $20,000 per vehicle. And that's what you need. This is where it's not good enough just to say, stop this, regulate this. But you got to give both producers and consumers an incentive to do this. The other thing I like is that the California law complements the incentives that the Biden administration has just put through in Congress in this bill. Because one of the hallmarks of this bill is that it's providing incentives for particularly poorer households to buy electric vehicles. Well, that's not in the California law, but equally, the federal law doesn't have this kind of mandatory thing. So the two work really well together. And I think that if they both hold, and who knows, we could have a change in the federal administration that overturns everything, and we could have a change even in California that overturns everything. But at least for now, people are starting to see that this is the right path where we have to go. So I think both are complements and they work together. Other things, well, one of the problems in this country is that we have such a deadlock when it comes to global policy. And I think when it comes to green issues, the American people, despite the deadlock, the vast majority, like myself, are fed up with greenwash from business and hogwash from politicians. And so what's happening is that the power is happening at the local and state level, which is maybe where it should, and even regional levels. Groups of like-minded states, like in the Northeast, there's a group of states that are clubbing together to put together regional climate policies and incentives across states, which is great because they're smaller states. But together, collectively, they're quite powerful. We're seeing, like I mentioned, the use of gray water. We also have locally a plastics ban. All the stores here now have to get rid of plastic and provide paper, and they can charge for paper, but it's no longer plastic. That's the sort of thing that we're starting to see at local levels. Of course, various states have got carbon taxes, carbon pricing. California is one of them, and others. So there are things that are happening at the subnational level that's more encouraging than at the national level. My big concern is that there isn't enough attention paid to what is the collective effect of these things. First, we need to know how much, if California does this, joined by Washington and Massachusetts, they bring in this car rule, how will it affect things? We need more understanding of that. And let's assume that nothing happens at the national level. Is that good enough? Or do we need more? We need more studies of that, because that's just the system we live in. And we need more information to ordinary consumers and voters to understand what's going on so they can make the right choice, both whether in local referenda on specific things like plastics pollution bans and all that stuff, or to vote for the right congressperson or state senator or so forth. What's their green policy? And if we want change, it has to come from us, and to use our democratic and our market votes, our dollar, to make the change. What we purchase matters, and that's starting to happen. Then, of course, the other area that we talked about earlier is the finance end, is that investors need to make their presence felt. And many of us are shareholders as well. We own mutual funds with a lot of investments in them. And so we need to make our sentiments felt and let investors and financial institutions know that it matters. That's where we have to go.
I'm glad that you said local and regional really matter, because I think that's where the groundswell becomes. That's where we get the action happening to get the, at least the notifications of why it matters to us in our local communities and why. And also, I think that also helps teach younger people, the younger generation, if they're not learning it in school, they can learn it from their local communities of why it matters to us and why we have to take a real deep look into what we're buying, when we're buying, and how we're buying. And it all makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I think so. And also, obviously, I'm a university professor. I interact with young people all the time. And the thing I'm so concerned about is that obviously I want to avoid leaving them a planet that is in worse shape. We got it. But more importantly, I'm concerned that they need to be very active. It's their world that we're fighting over. And their world, they want to feel involved, but they also want to make sure that they're able to have a difference. When they get involved locally and regionally, they can see the difference and they can feel good about the change. When we talk about global problems and everything that's gone wrong, it can really depress them and make them feel, why should I bother? I'll just go back on TikTok and talk with my friends, and stuff. But I mean, that's why in this book, I have tried not to talk so much about the problem, although I obviously have to explain the problem, why it's so urgent, why we need to do something quickly. But most of the book is about what can we do. And although I'm obviously dealing mainly with policies at the national, regional, or even global level, and the actions we can do by governments and business and individuals, I'm hoping that also people who read this will understand that these are things that can be more easily done at the local level and state level that they live in. And it can. And that's often where the most progress is being made right now. And it will make a difference. It'll make a difference immediately in their local area. But if enough places do it, then we'll start to see an overall impact that's positive.
No, definitely. And one of the things there's a bunch of stuff that I would love to dig into, and I don't know how much time we have, but one of the things that I really liked in the book was you were comparing, and I think it maybe with the World Economic Forum, degree of freedom.
Yes.
Which we can use the word democracy if we want, and greenness. And you have a chart. It's called a freedom score. It's like a XY axis, and you've got a freedom score and you've got a green score. Can you talk a little bit about that? You did the G20s, I think, or 19 members of the G20.
I will have to correct you. Unfortunately, this little piece of my talk I put in after my book was published. So it's not actually in the book. The reason I put it in was, as you mentioned, my book was launched in March 2022, and this was one of my book launch talks. And of course, what was on everyone's mind was the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which was a clear undemocratic move, and particularly a move where you have a state that is run by a very autocratic leader with support by oligarchs, all who make lots of money out of fossil fuels, and attacking a country that is moving more Western and more democratic, and to bring it under control. And of course, a lot of people were asking, well, is green now a luxury? Do we have to get back to this issue of energy security, national security, and a democracy versus, Cold War 2.0, where it's, democratic Western states versus autocratic entities, whether it's Russia or possibly China and maybe others. And so that's why I put that piece in my talk. And what I wanted to remind people is that when you look at the recent evidence, whether it's the recent green stimulus spending during COVID-19, whether it's tackling the problem of underpricing, or whether you're talking about the dependency of economies on fossil fuel, there's a clear correlation between countries that have been more green, that they've adopted greener stimulus policies, or they have reduced their underpricing, or they are less dependent on fossil fuels. Those countries that are more green tend to be more democratic. They tend to be freer. And so I used the Freedom House Index of Freedom and compared it against the greenness of economies. And particularly for the 19 countries that make up the G20, the 20th country is European Union. And I could have put them on the graph and they would also show the same thing. You have this clear trend that the countries that are more free, more democratic, have more democratic institutions, generally have been more green in recent years than the countries that are autocratic, even within these 20 largest economies of the world. But that's important. These 20 economies account for 80% of the GDP and 75 or 85% of greenhouse gas emissions and so on. And of course, they're the most populous countries of the world too. So what happens there is important, and they set the pace for the rest of the world. So it's becoming clear moving forward, and that's some of the work that I'd like to do, is that there's a clear coalition. Just like if we're thinking about parts of the world that are democratic needing to help each other, well, greenness is part of that. They're also the countries that have a stake in green, have shown that they have an interest in stake in greenness. And that's because they're democratic, I think, because their populations want to be greener. And many of their populations, particularly in these poorer countries that are democratic, realize that loss of the environment affects their livelihoods more directly than it does in our richer countries. And so I think moving forward, we're going to see more of interest at reviving and recognizing that economies that are going to face threats to their democracies are facing threats to their green transition. If they're not careful, they have to work together to collectively promote a green transition, but at the same time, protect their democracy. They go hand in hand.
I love that. I was going to say, I love that because that's what we talk about, right? It's all about nature's all about hope and growth and expansion. So that what you just said about becoming more, the green economy is that is what it's all about. How do we then come together as more democratic to make sure we're putting things in place to have more hope, to have more growth and expansion, and versus this doom and gloom, which is so much sitting over so many of us right now.
Yes, I agree. And also it's very straightforward, I think, to make green economies more inclusive. I mean, by definition, many of the things you do that green economy make people who are poor better off. And if not, you can find things to make it more inclusive. And that's got to be an important goal. That's why I put that as my fifth goal, is making it more inclusive. And that's easier to do. I mean, what we're seeing, evidence shows by many economists, particularly Thomas Piketty and many others, have shown that in the same 50 years that we've seen environmental impacts just accelerate, we've seen worsening global inequality, whether you use income or wealth as your measure, both within countries and between countries, but really within countries. We're seeing growing gaps, being rich before, and more wealth is concentrated in the hands of fewer people, or there's a bigger gap between the very rich and the very poor. And so our economy is not delivering also in terms of lifting people out of poverty or reducing this disparity in wealth and income. It's making it worse. Unfortunately, many of the people who have wealth are going to maybe try and protect their interests if we're not careful. So it is a tough thing. We're seeing it's a real, I think, both these issues. That segment that I put in my talk, I labeled "The Color of Democracy is Green." And that's I think, the bottom line.
Yeah, no, I love that the sustainability in the corporations, the government, and financial performance needs to be correlated, just like you're saying that, democracy or freedom is correlated with taking care of nature and having greenness. As we sort of wrap up here, is there anything, I could probably talk to you, I'm sure Jen felt the same way, for another hour. This has been so interesting. Do you have any final thoughts you want to share, or something we didn't touch on that you feel like is very important?
I think we covered pretty much all the ground.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Ranging. So I really appreciate it. Yeah.
How can we support you? Do you have social accounts or anything that we can promote in our show notes or anything like that?
Actually, I don't have a social account for many reasons.
Totally understand.
And believe me, writing on this stuff has not been costless for me personally. So it's really promoting the book would be helpful. And also, I still have my personal website, which people are welcome to go through, www.edwardbbarbier.com, or just Google me at Colorado State University and people will be able to find my stuff.
And can people take your classes? Like if I was in the area, I would love to sit in. And I mean, are you teaching based on this book? Or do you have a book club that people can join or follow along? Because I just think it's such important content.
I teach both undergraduates and graduates. I teach generally at a high level class. My wife, who's also an environmental economist and also works on the green issues, teaches a course that is open to those without any economics teaching it. Unfortunately, it's for CSU students, so you would have to be a Colorado State student to take it. There are also courses that our department is putting online for those interested, including this course. But no, that's pretty much, other than public lectures and podcasts, I have no book club per se. But people find me. I make my material available through my website, and then people find me through books and things. So
fantastic.
You're putting out your green beacon.
Yes.
Put up my green
beacon of hope.
Yeah, I do.
Beacon of hope.
Thank you, Ed. We really, really appreciate you taking so much time with us today to really dive into your work, which is so important and impactful. And we really appreciate your time.
And we'll put a link to the book in the show notes. It's super important. We want everybody to go buy it. It's super interesting and so important for us to understand this, because if we don't understand it, then we can't ask for the change that we want.
Thank you.
So thank you, Ed, so much.
Thank you, guys.
Wow. I mean, that was such a fascinating and full conversation. I'm not even sure where to start.
I'm with you. I really feel like Ed is one of those guests we need to follow up with. There were so many questions and ideas I wanted to hear his opinion on, including whether he's ever gotten any pushback about valuing nature in economic terms. We didn't really have time to get into that, but I think it's a compelling question.
I would say before our conversation with Ed, I could have argued either way. Like, nature is so intrinsically good. How could we ever talk about it economically? But now I'm kind of bought in. Like, I can't convince a fossil fuel executive with my feelings, however much I might want to. What we can all do is demonstrate that unsustainable practices hurt bottom lines and petition for cutting subsidies or imposing taxes on harmful practices.
Yeah, this whole conversation made me think about the concept we've explored many times on the podcast, which is long-term versus short-term thinking. So I think over the long haul, so many businesses and governments are losing revenue as a result of climate, or I should say environmental damage, but there's a lack of motivation to make big changes because of short-term profits and upfront costs to make those changes.
Absolutely. It's so easy to maintain the status quo, but we're just not in that position to do that anymore.
No, we're definitely not. It's definitely promising to see the strides that are being made on the national level with the Inflation Reduction Act and with the electric vehicle law coming out of California, but there's much more work to be done.
Also, after this conversation with Ed about water, I want to point briefly to the really harrowing situation in Jackson, Mississippi, where the city literally doesn't have water. This is a major American city with infrastructure so broken that residents don't have water for basic things like flushing toilets and fighting fires. And I believe the root of all this is major flooding. So my point is that these issues are urgent, and curbing environmental impact is something we really need to push for right now.
Yes, the situation in Jackson is so devastating, but we've included some resources in our show notes, so please check those out while you're listening. And yes, to your point about advocating for change, I think starting at the local level makes sense. At least for me, it feels like so much more actionable because we all have direct access to our city council members. We can take steps in all of our own backyards.
Yeah, it was especially reassuring to talk about the importance of local action with Ed, because he's someone whose research is all about the global impact.
Yes, so pick up a copy of Ed's book today, Economics for a Fragile Planet, in our show notes, and take some of the ideas to your next city council meeting. You never know what might happen.
Great idea, Monica. Talk to you later.
Bye, Jennifer. Thanks so much for listening. And if you're enjoying the podcast, we would love for you to follow us on your favorite podcast app, give us a 5-star rating, and please leave us a review.
It really goes such a long way towards helping us reach a wider audience and sharing these amazing interviews and solutions with the world.
Absolutely. So thanks so much for following and reviewing the podcast, and we'll be back with another amazing interview in 2 weeks. You're now a part of the Biophilic movement.